Hey everyone, I'm Jack.
And I'm Alex.
And in today's video, we'll be following up our ranking of Cuphead the Delicious Last Course's bosses based on their quality with a much requested ranking of their difficulty on normal and expert. Alex and I are privy to opinions on the difficulty of bosses due to our long history with the Souls series. However, this is our first official easiest to hardest ranking video, and with that we set a few prerequisites for the sake of consistency. Those being, Alex and I replayed the entire DLC as Miss Chalice, with Crackshot equipped as main and Charge as secondary. Lastly, we're both beyond grateful for the massive support our first DLC video got, and equally excited to continue to rank these beautifully designed bosses. With that out of the way, let's rank.
This is essentially a lengthy Congo line of gimmick bosses. Some of them, like the Bishop, took me a little bit to figure out, but once you have their number, they pretty much can't touch you. The Knight provides the only semblance of challenge of the whole lot, and as long as you can rein in your impatience, Miss Chalice's 4 HP and dash parry should be more than enough to take him out.
The Moonshine Mob, or Moonlight Mob as put by a certain me in our previous video, becomes significantly more manageable with Crackshot and Charge at use. While the first phase feels slightly overcompensated with bugs in the works, Crackshot makes quick work of any excess dangers, allowing you to focus solely on the spider mobster. Reasonably, he isn't overly complicated, but is still best handled through staying in the middle of the arena and either one above or one below whichever floor he's on. Similarly, the second phase, or Ladybug, is nothing more than strategic positioning. Charge makes quick work of her, and so long as you pay attention to which string of musical notes gets corrupted, you should have no trouble smoke rolling, dropping and running, or dashing your way to the other side and avoiding damage altogether. The last phase remains the most tedious of the three, no matter how much experience with this fight you get, however. Charge is extremely useful in getting rid of the spitballs, though the Anteater is realistically an endurance test capped off by the ant that, par for the course, gets one shot by Charge. The Moonshine Mob is trivial in challenge, but for beginner players should prove a fruitful test.
Going to normal mode after mastering expert mode for this fight is really weird. It feels like everything moves in slow motion. The tennis balls, the yarn, the letters, it's like being a significantly less cool Neo from the Matrix. The real challenge of this fight is in the final phase, what with all the trippy screen rotations and dog bowl spam. They were kind enough to color code the dog bowls based on the elevation they swerve around at, which ensures it never becomes that big a deal so long as they are moving at Mach 8 speed like they do in Expert. Considering the first two phases are basically free and the last phase isn't too tanky, this is a boss that won't be taking many names after the shock of the initial screen flipping reveal. There is a secret phase that replaces the last one if you really just can't cut it, so even then there's a nuclear option that bypasses the main challenge for anyone struggling with it.
Alex and I's least favorite of the DLC bosses files in at a measly number 5 for difficulty. While I originally claimed Miss Chalice makes no difference in fighting this boss, that is entirely untrue. With her parry dash as well as her built-in smoke dash, you only have to face one devil for the majority of the time aside from occasionally resetting position, and even then you can parry nearly all of the available fireballs. That's not to say it's easy, anything but with a decent amount of practice and the right set of tools, the devil and angel aren't nearly as bad as they appear on the surface.
This is the fight that sees the biggest difficulty jump between normal and expert in my opinion. Here in the safety of normal mode, you don't have to worry nearly as much about the second phase unleashing furious legions of good humor bars at you at inopportune moments, which is a pretty significant difference. You're more or less free to focus on avoiding Mortimer himself, who is a bit tricky but not nightmarishly so. The third phase is also a breath of fresh air on normal mode, most notably when he squeezes out a peeper to fly around it doesn't shoot lightning every 2 nanoseconds. I didn't even mention phase 1 because he's usually done with it in like 10 seconds and not much of note happens there. Mortimer is on the harder end of the overall boss scale, but as far as the DLC goes, he's middle of the pack.
Once again, I lied from inexperience previously when saying Miss Chalice has minimal impact on the difficulty of Glumstone the Giant. While the challenge of the first phase is mainly diminished by Crackshot, which single-handedly gets rid of the Hammer Gnomes and Ground Gnomes while also dealing significant damage to Glumstone, Miss Chalice makes handling the magic potion a cinch over it being a nuisance as Cuphead. Moves such as the Geese Swarm and Bear become far less difficult as well with Crackshot, seeing as not only are you still able to damage the boss, but also can get rid of any external threat while you're forced to be stationary. However, Charge is personally the best course of action in the second phase. It's not that hard either way, but it simply makes it go quicker, and I'd suggest saving the super for the last phase in case you do happen to take damage from not moving enough so as to avoid the gnomes. This last phase is where Chalice's impact is most present, with the parry dash, the parryable platforms that open up when hit with a bone, as well as the parryable blow darts are very easy to handle, and her double jump into dash makes the platforming little more than a stroll. Glumstone the Giant, while still fairly hard, is essentially a showcase displaying the massively easier experience fighting a boss when using Miss Chalice rather than Cuphead, although he is still one of the more difficult DLC bosses on normal.
As much as Jack and I love this fight, it's admittedly sort of a clusterfuck. It can be hard to tell what's part of the background versus what can actually hurt you, and until you internalize that narrowing your focus on your plane is for the best, it can be daunting. Avoiding damage in the last two phases is a tall order considering they both take what feels like an eternity to whittle down, with the last one tanking 2 supers to the face and change without dying. The difficulty is fairly balanced in my opinion, although I definitely find the first two a bit easier from having experienced them the most. The trajectory of the Phase 3 stakes is extremely unorthodox and definitely takes some getting used to avoid. I mostly ranked these based off of how hard they were for me to beat without getting hit, and without a doubt Esther is an endurance fight that none but Saltbaker can hold a candle to.
While I personally am in my golden age of Cuphead ability, Chef Saltbaker remains one of the hardest fights on base difficulty entirely due to his first phase. Through a mixture of blindingly sporadic projectiles, an endless barrage of attacks with different angles of entry and movement patterns, and that goddamn fire thing, this phase is one practically no one without the reactionary speed of Grandmaster Luke Skywalker will be able to nail down without ungodly amounts of practice. Admittedly, I do not struggle as severely as I did yesterday, but it's still quite difficult to no damage this phase, and in some instances, Miss Chalice's parrying ability actually makes you come out worse than you would playing as Cuphead. Nonetheless, the difficulty drop-off is semi-drastic once you escape the kitchen. The Pepper Shaker is one of the most sensory overloading phases of any in Cuphead, although, like Esther Winchester or Hildeberg, when you take a step back and watch footage, you realize there's not a ton going on. The difficulty of this phase is made through the falling leaves in tandem with the Fire Spirit, although in reverse, Crackshot and the fact that the Pepper Shakers aim for your head makes it equally easier. However, this phase does take the longest, seeing as your super is rendered useless, leading into the shortest and least notable fight of any in the DLC, some salt structure that's likely an obscure cooking joke that's flying over my head. Moving on, with Miss Chalice, the heart is barely a challenge. While her parry dash can cause some consequence in overloaded combat sections, as said earlier, platforming segments are easy as they come. With Crackshot equipped, all you need to pay attention to is positioning yourself so as to parry the heart, and otherwise, for a final phase, this is nothing less than leisurely. While hard at first, Miss Chalice and Crackshot absolutely breaks the later phases of Chef Saltbaker, although due to the obscene difficulty of his beginning phase, he earns his spot as the hardest normal difficulty boss in the delicious last course.
Alright, now for the expert rankings. This is going to be a lot quicker, since there are only 6 bosses to discuss, with the Angel Devil fight and the King's Gauntlet absent due to their lack of an expert mode. Additionally, we already talked about the mechanics of each fight, and expert mode only changes so much, so we'll really just be speeding through this with some more general explanations. The last thing to mention is that in this segment we'll just use music from the base game for the whole thing, since it's one continuous bit and changing the music would sound weird. With that out of the way, let's get to the back end of the video.
Number 6, the Moonshine Mob. One of the easiest bosses on normal, and the same goes for expert. Unlike many, there are few changes at all to this fight. The only ones worth noting is a higher volume of web bombs in phase 1 and faster gramophone notes in phase 2. I found it best to actually stay on the top floor and equip Crackshot over staying level with the Ladybug and using charge, as the waves are much faster, and this way you'll almost never get hit. Otherwise, all is the same and the Moonshine Mob stays fairly identical to its normal fight throughout.
Number 5, the Howling Aces. I have a lot more trouble with these guys than Jack does. I can take a giant piss all over the first 2 phases, but that last stretch with the screen rotations and lasers always gets me 2 or 3 times. This fight isn't that different on Expert besides attack speeds, but that can be a real hassle with the lasers if you make the same mistake I do, where I instinctively run to the side without the guns rather than vice versa for some reason.
Number 4, Glumstone the Giant. Miss Chalice is the difference on Expert, almost removing the challenge of the magic potion entirely depending on player's skill. Save your super for the second phase, as inverted to normal, this is by far the hardest. You won't have enough time to use charge due to the gnomes popping out at a much higher rate, so Crackshot is almost a necessity to begin with. I recommend actually staying centered in the arena instead of under the puppets as I said in the first video, so long as you're shifting positions constantly and only smoke rolling when one puppet throws the ball to the other. The last phase remains the easiest, although premeditated planning in terms of platforming, a lot of P's there, is suggested.
Number 3, Esther Winchester. I said the last 2 phases were hard on normal, but they're gracefully more or less the same on Expert. Phase 2 is where you see the big buffs. Dodging all the shrapnel from the falling safes demands extreme precision, and I always just stay in the mini plane for this part. Hard for the same reasons as it is on normal mode, but amplified mostly in terms of speed and projectile volume.
Number 2, Mortimer Freeze. This thing took me something around 4 fucking ever to beat on Expert. He was actually my number 1 choice for this bit, although by comparison, the second phase of this fight on Expert is still relatively nowhere close to Chef Saltbaker's first phase, also on Expert. It's still arguably the second hardest of any in Cuphead in general, however, with ridiculously tight spacing and very hard reactionary combat. I recommend Crackshot throughout the entire fight, specific moments with the fridge aside, as simply you don't have enough time to use charge. As well, I suggest using a super right at the phase 1 to 2 transition, should Mortimer give you enough parryable cards. The third phase is just about the same on normal, however, meaning should you top the absurdly difficult snowman, winning is extremely feasible.
Number 1, Chef Saltbaker. As with normal mode, the amount of shit flying around is absolutely insane. The only way you can get past the first phase reliably is entering some kind of hyper-focused zen state where you experience time at like 1/100th of its normal speed. It also sometimes pisses me off how much Saltbaker moves around when I'm using the charge shot. For what is supposedly one of those giant heads in the background to whack bosses, he shifts around the arena like a total spaz. It's like trying to shoot the world's skinniest belly dancer in the torso from 2 miles away with a sniper rifle while she's hopped up on cocaine. Phase 2 is a bit easier, and the last stretch is basically free, but good luck dodging the endless droves of limes and random fireballs for a whole minute. It's like trying to dodge raindrops during a hurricane. Bar none, the hardest Expert mode boss in my opinion.
Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to check out not just our ranking of the quality of the Delicious Last Course's bosses, but the bosses of Cuphead as well. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't, and be on the lookout every Wednesday for new rankings. That's all for now. Deuces.